The evening sun was dipping low over the horizon, casting long golden streaks across the empty highway. The sound of cicadas echoed in the distance, filling the stillness with a droning reminder that nightfall was near. On the shoulder of the road, a sleek black car sat unmoving, its hood propped open, steam still rising from its overheated engine. The owner of the vehicle, a tall black man in his late 30s, stood beside it with calm patience. His suit jacket was folded neatly over the passenger seat, his white shirt rolled up at the sleeves, and his polished shoes dusted from walking back and forth trying to find cell reception. He wasn't a man prone to panic. His demeanor was steady, his eyes thoughtful, as though he had been through harder moments before. Yet this situation, simple as it was, carried with it an undercurrent of frustration. He had been on his way to an important dinner meeting, one that required punctuality and presence, and now he stood stranded, miles from the nearest gas station, unable to flag down a passing car. Traffic was light that evening. A few trucks thundered past, not slowing, not sparing a glance. The man's phone flickered with one bar of signal, too weak to place a proper call for roadside assistance. He sighed, folded his arms, and leaned against the fender. He knew patience, but patience felt heavier when the sun kept sinking lower and the shadows stretched longer. It was then that the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the quiet. A white patrol car pulled up behind him, its headlights flashing briefly before the engine cut. Relief should have been the natural reaction, but what came instead was hesitation. Experience had taught him that encounters like this didn't always end with kindness. He straightened his posture, adjusted his stance, and prepared for whatever tone the officer chose to take. The door opened, and a uniformed officer stepped out. His stride was confident, almost exaggerated, with the kind of swagger belonging to someone who believed the road was his domain. His mirrored sunglasses reflected the fading sky as he walked closer. From the very first moment, his body language carried more mockery than concern. The officer glanced at the car, then at the man standing beside it, and smirked. Instead of offering help, his eyes scanned the scene with a look that wasn't curiosity but condescension. He chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as though the sight before him was entertainment rather than misfortune. For a moment, the man simply watched. He didn't respond, didn't flinch, didn't let the officer's mocking tone disturb his calm exterior. But deep inside, he felt the sting of recognition. This wasn't new. He had encountered it before, being judged, belittled, underestimated, all because of the color of his skin. The officer circled the car slowly, pretending to inspect it, his laughter cutting through the thickening night air. Every gesture, every movement suggested that he saw the stranded man not as someone in need of help, but as someone beneath him. He cracked jokes at the car's expense, treating the moment like a spectacle, as though the man's misfortune was the punchline of a private comedy show. Yet the man held his composure. He didn't raise his voice, didn't betray the weariness that threatened to surface. Instead, he let silence answer the laughter. He stood tall, his gaze steady, his presence unshaken. It was the kind of quiet dignity that spoke louder than words ever could. But inside, a storm brewed. Memories of other encounters flickered through his mind. Times when he had been underestimated. Times when laughter or suspicion or open hostility had greeted him instead of respect. He had worked hard, fought for every ounce of success, built a life that stood on resilience and perseverance. And still, moments like these reminded him that in some eyes, he would always be reduced to a stereotype, a target for mockery. The officer leaned against his patrol car, still grinning, still making light of the situation. He didn't ask where the man was headed, didn't offer to call a tow truck, didn't even acknowledge the frustration of being stranded. Instead, he reveled in the imbalance of power, in the unspoken message that he had authority and the stranded man did not. The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving the road bathed in a dim orange glow. The man looked out toward the darkening stretch of highway, weighing his options. He knew he didn't need the officer's help, not really. He could wait, find a way to call for assistance, manage the situation as he always did, with patience and resolve. But part of him also knew that this encounter was not just about a broken car. It was about something larger, something that had followed him all his life. And so he waited. He let the officer laugh, let him underestimate, let him believe he was witnessing the struggles of just another stranded man. What the officer didn't know What he couldn't yet see was that the man he mocked was far more than the situation suggested. His identity carried weight. His work had influence. His presence mattered in rooms where decisions were made, where voices were heard, where respect was commanded. But for now, he remained silent. For now, he allowed the officer to show his true colors. Because sometimes, the most powerful lessons are taught not in the moment of mockery, but in the revelation that follows. As night fell fully over the highway, and the cicada's song grew louder, the officer's laughter still echoed against the quiet road. But change was coming. The balance of power in this small encounter was about to shift. And when it did, the officer would realize he hadn't just laughed at a broken car. He had laughed at someone whose name carried far more weight than he could imagine. Darkness had settled across the highway now, the once golden horizon swallowed by deep shades of navy and black. Streetlights were scarce, and the only illumination came from the weak flicker of the stranded car's hazard lights and the steady glow of the patrol car's headlights. Against that backdrop, the officer's laughter rang louder, more careless, as if the night itself was his stage. He leaned casually against his cruiser, arms folded, posture loose, every motion dripping with the confidence of unchecked authority. His smirk had grown wider, his tone sharper, carrying not the weight of assistance but the arrogance of superiority. To him, this was no stranded citizen. This was a scene to mock, a moment to assert dominance, a chance to reduce someone to less than they truly were. The man beside the broken car remained steady. His shirt, still crisp despite the evening humidity, clung lightly to his frame. His tie hung loose, and his polished shoes reflected the pale gleam of headlights. He had spent years mastering composure, years learning how silence could speak louder than any rebuttal. Yet inside, he felt the burn of frustration, the deep ache of familiarity. He had seen this arrogance before, in boardrooms, in airports, on sidewalks, in stores. The uniform was different now, but the treatment was the same. The officer began pacing, circling again with an air of mock inspection. He peered under the hood briefly, not to help but to scoff, muttering sharp little laughs at the sight of the steam still curling upward. He shook his head as though the very image of the car breaking down was comedy gold. Every gesture carried the same message: you don't belong. You're not worthy of respect. You're just another man with a broken car on the side of the road. The man folded his arms and studied him. He didn't need to raise his voice or defend himself. He knew the truth of who he was, even if the officer did not. His career, his accomplishments, his reputation, all stood in stark contrast to the assumptions being made about him in this moment. Minutes stretched on. Cars passed by occasionally, headlights sweeping across the scene, but none slowed. Each vehicle carried people rushing to their own destinations, unaware of the quiet injustice unfolding on the shoulder of the road. The officer's arrogance only grew. He chuckled louder, leaned closer, exaggerated his gestures. He seemed to enjoy the performance, feeding off the silence of the man who refused to give him the reaction he sought. It was as though he needed this, needed to remind himself of the control he believed he had. But the man's silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. He knew that sometimes the greatest strength lay not in reacting, but in observing, in allowing others to reveal who they truly were. And this officer was revealing everything: his lack of empathy, his shallow view of the world, his misuse of the badge he wore. Time ticked on, the night deepening. The man's phone flickered again with a brief signal, just enough to light the screen before vanishing into nothing. He slipped it back into his pocket calmly. He would wait. Help would come. But more than that, he knew that this moment would not end as the officer expected. For the man standing by the car was not just another stranded driver. He was someone whose name carried weight in halls of power, whose voice resonated in communities and institutions, whose work had touched countless lives. His influence extended far beyond this stretch of highway, into boardrooms, government chambers, and networks of people who respected and valued him. The officer didn't know that. He didn't see it. All he saw was the surface, the skin, the car, the situation. And from that, he built his arrogance, his laughter, his mockery. But soon, the surface would crack. Soon, the truth would emerge. And when it did, the officer's laughter would falter. The man adjusted his stance, straightened his tie, and looked directly at the officer. Not with anger, not with submission, but with the calm assurance of someone who knew the truth would eventually speak for itself. The night grew cooler. Crickets joined the cicadas in their chorus. Far in the distance, the faint sound of another engine grew closer. Headlights appeared, growing brighter, approaching steadily. The man recognized the shape of the vehicle, the sleek design, the tinted windows. It wasn't another patrol car, and it wasn't an ordinary passerby. It was someone he knew, someone who would recognize him instantly. The officer, oblivious, continued his laughter, too wrapped in his own performance to notice the approaching car. But the man knew. He could feel the shift coming, the turning of the moment, the unraveling of arrogance. And as the car slowed, pulling onto the shoulder behind the patrol vehicle, the man remained silent. He didn't need to announce anything. The truth was about to speak for itself, louder than any retort, sharper than any confrontation. The officer's arrogance was about to collide with reality. And when it did, the balance of power on this darkened highway would never be the same again. The approaching vehicle slowed as it neared the small scene on the roadside, its headlights cutting sharp lines through the night. The sleek black SUV glided to a stop behind the patrol car, its tinted windows hiding the faces inside until the doors opened. From the driver's side, a sharply dressed man stepped out, his expression serious, his stride confident. Moments later, another figure emerged from the passenger seat, a woman with the same air of authority, scanning the scene with quick, assessing eyes. The stranded man stood quietly beside his broken-down car, watching as recognition flashed across their faces. Relief was not what stirred within him. It was confirmation. He had known this moment would come. He had known that arrogance could only hold power in ignorance, and ignorance could not last forever. The officer, however, remained oblivious. He leaned casually against his cruiser, smirk still plastered across his face, arms folded as if he were presiding over some grand joke. When he finally noticed the newcomers, his expression shifted slightly, but not with humility. Instead, he straightened his posture, preparing to assert his authority once again. He saw them only as more witnesses to his imagined superiority. But the newcomers knew better. They approached the stranded man with respect, their tone measured, their gestures professional. One nodded at him with recognition that was subtle yet unmistakable, the kind that carried the weight of shared history, of networks intertwined at higher levels. Their body language made it clear. This was no ordinary man standing on the roadside. The officer's grin faltered for the first time. He looked between them, confusion flickering behind his mirrored sunglasses. He had expected laughter, or at least indifference, but what he saw instead was deference, the quiet respect one shows to someone of stature. The stranded man adjusted his tie, his movements deliberate, calm, and unhurried. He didn't need to explain himself. He didn't need to announce his position, his title, or his accomplishments. The truth was unfolding in the reactions of those who had just arrived. The officer's arrogance began to crack. Questions darted through his mind. Who was this man? Why did these people, clearly influential themselves, treat him with such regard? Why had he assumed so quickly that the stranded driver was beneath him? Silence hung thick in the air, broken only by the hum of engines and the soft buzz of cicadas. The officer shifted uneasily, his earlier laughter now a memory that weighed heavier with each passing second. The arrogance that had once fueled him drained slowly away, replaced by the creeping realization that he had made a mistake, not just in judgment, but in character. The newcomers spoke quietly to the stranded man, their words lost in the night air, but their intent clear. They were here to help, to resolve the situation with efficiency and respect. They checked the car, offered solutions, made calls. The officer, meanwhile, stood to the side, watching helplessly as the balance of power shifted entirely out of his control. What had once been his stage was now his shame. The stranded man remained composed. He hadn't raised his voice once, hadn't resorted to anger or confrontation. He hadn't needed to. His dignity, his presence, his very identity carried more weight than the officer's arrogance could ever hold. He allowed the silence to speak for him, allowed the truth of who he was to unfold naturally in the moment. And then, the final blow came, not through confrontation, but through recognition. The officer finally caught the name spoken aloud by one of the newcomers. It was a name he had seen before, in headlines and articles, a name associated with leadership, influence, and change. It was the name of someone who sat on boards, advised leaders, spoke at conferences, and shaped policy. The man he had mocked was no ordinary citizen stranded by the roadside. He was a figure of national recognition, a man whose voice carried weight across industries, communities, and governments. The officer's breath caught. His arrogance crumbled completely, replaced by the cold rush of realization. He hadn't just laughed at a broken car. He had laughed at a man whose work had touched lives far beyond his understanding. He had mocked someone who commanded respect from people of power, people whose opinions shaped entire systems. And more importantly, he had revealed himself. He had exposed the smallness of his own character, the hollowness of his uniform when stripped of empathy and respect. His badge had not given him power that night. It had only magnified the weakness of his arrogance. The stranded man glanced at him one last time, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a calm gaze that held more weight than words ever could. It was the kind of look that said, "I see you. I see what you chose to be in this moment. And I don't need to say a word, because the truth has already spoken." The officer shifted uncomfortably, the silence suffocating now, his earlier laughter haunting him like an echo he couldn't silence. He wanted to retreat, to escape, to undo what could not be undone. But there was no escape from the truth. He had revealed himself in full view of witnesses, and the memory of his arrogance would linger far longer than the sound of his laughter. The SUV's occupants finished their quiet arrangements. A tow truck was called, assistance secured, and the stranded man's evening realigned. He would not be left abandoned on the roadside, not because of who he was, but because of the respect he had earned long before this night. As the group prepared to leave, the man gathered his folded jacket, straightened his posture, and stepped into the SUV. The car door closed with finality, sealing the lesson of the night in the silence that followed. The officer stood alone now, the roadside emptying, the night reclaiming its stillness. His uniform felt heavier, his badge less polished, his laughter a memory he wished he could erase. He had mocked a man not knowing who he was, but the truth was, it didn't matter who he was. Respect should not be reserved for names or titles. Dignity should not depend on recognition. Every human being deserved the respect he had denied. And now, in the quiet aftermath of his arrogance, he understood that too late. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless. The officer sat back in his cruiser, the silence pressing down on him, and for the first time that night, he didn't laugh. Because some lessons come softly, and others arrive like a storm, dismantling arrogance and leaving only truth behind. This was the night he learned the difference.